If I'd known what this place was hiding, I'd have driven straight past it that day and never looked back. But I didn't know. I didn't know because I was desperate. And desperation makes you blind to warning signs. It makes you see promises where there are only cracks. I was running, not from someone, but from the person I had been. I hated the version of myself that had lived in the city, working a dead-end job I pretended to care about, hanging out with people I didn't even like, numbing myself on weekends with booze and Netflix. My apartment was small, noisy, and always felt like it belonged to someone else. When I saw the listing for a cottage in a town I'd never heard of, I knew I had to take it. The picture showed a cozy little house tucked into the woods, with ivy crawling up the sides and a wildflower garden out front. Black Hollow. Even the name sounded peaceful. Rent was dirt cheap, less than half of what I'd been paying in the city. It almost seemed too good to be true. I packed up my life in a couple of boxes, crammed them into the back of my car, and drove until the skyline disappeared, replaced by rolling hills and dense forests. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going. There wasn't anyone who'd miss me anyway. By the time I reached Black Hollow, the sun was starting to set, casting the woods in deep orange and gold. The town was even smaller than I'd imagined. Just a single road lined with mismatched houses, a general store with hand-painted signs, and a diner with a flickering neon open sign in the window. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. My cottage was at the edge of town, right where the trees grew thick and close. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe even better. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. After years of honking cars and shouting neighbors, the silence was intoxicating. I spent the first few hours unpacking and settling in. The house had everything I needed: faded but clean furniture, a tiny kitchen with a window overlooking the woods, and a fireplace I couldn't wait to try out. I made a mental note to pick up firewood from the general store the next day. As night fell, I noticed something strange. There were no streetlights. The only light came from my windows and the faint glow of the moon. It was darker than anything I'd experienced before, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you're the last person left in the world. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through an old book I'd found on the shelf, when I heard it. Faint at first, like a distant hum. I thought it might be the wind, but then it grew louder, more rhythmic, chanting. I froze, straining to hear. The sound was coming from outside, somewhere deep in the woods. I turned off the lamp and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the vague outlines of trees. But then, faintly, I saw them. Shadowy figures moving between the trunks, carrying lanterns that swayed with each step. My heart raced. I told myself it was probably some kind of local tradition, maybe a late-night hike or a bonfire. But there was something about the way they moved, slow and deliberate, that made my skin crawl. I closed the curtains and tried to ignore it, but the chanting stayed with me long after it faded into silence. The next morning, I walked into town still thinking about what I'd seen. The general store was run by an older man named Edwin, who greeted me with a wide smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "New in town?" he asked, handing me a bundle of firewood. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. I moved into the cottage on the edge of town. "Ah, the old Whitaker place. Good spot. Quiet. Very quiet," I said, hesitating. "Hey, do you guys have some kind of gathering in the woods at night? I thought I saw people out there." Edwin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to notice. "Just a little community thing," he said, waving it off. "Nothing to worry about." Before I could press him further, the door jingled as a woman walked in. She was in her 50s with gray-streaked hair tied in a neat bun and a kind but sharp look in her eyes. "You must be Randy," she said, holding out her hand. "I'm Grace. Welcome to Black Hollow." I shook her hand, feeling the warmth of her grip. "Thanks. It's nice to meet you. Edwin taking care of you?" she asked, giving him a knowing smile. "Oh, you know me," Edwin said, chuckling. Grace turned back to me, her expression softening. "If you need anything, just let me know. We're all family here." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Family wasn't a word I was used to hearing, at least not directed at me. That night, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the chanting. Maybe I'd been overtired. Maybe it was some kind of prank. But when I looked out the window, I noticed something odd. Marks on the ground near the tree line, as if several pairs of feet had trampled the undergrowth. Before I could think too much about it, there was a knock at the door. My stomach flipped. When I opened it, no one was there. But on the porch was a basket wrapped in a red and white checker cloth. Inside were a loaf of bread, a bundle of dried herbs, and a note written in neat cursive. "For you. Welcome to the family." I stepped back, glancing around the empty street. The only movement came from the swaying branches in the breeze. I shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. The bread smelled delicious, but I couldn't bring myself to eat it. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figures in the woods, their lanterns casting flickering shadows on the trees. And beneath it all, I thought I could still hear chanting. When you first arrive in Black Hollow, the stillness is intoxicating. After a week, though, it starts to feel oppressive. Like silence isn't the natural state of things, but something forced, held in place by something unseen. I was trying to settle in, get used to the slower pace of life. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. People were friendly enough, always smiling, always waving, but there was something rehearsed about it. Like they were all playing parts in a play I didn't have the script for. Every time I left the house, I'd catch people watching me just a second too long. They'd hold eye contact as if they were trying to measure me, to figure out where I fit in the picture. Even the kids were quiet. No shouting or laughter, just silent little groups that stared with wide, curious eyes. I told myself I was being paranoid. I'd come here to escape the chaos of my old life, to find peace. And now I was complaining that it was too quiet. Still, the unease followed me everywhere. The first Sunday night, I noticed something strange. Around dusk, the streets emptied. By the time the moon was up, the entire town had gone silent. Not a single window lit, not a single dog barking. I sat in the living room, trying to read, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. And then I heard it again, the chanting. It was fainter this time, but unmistakable. Low, rhythmic and guttural, like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The sound came from the woods. My chest tightened as I remembered the lanterns I'd seen on my first night. The memory had been nagging at me all week, but I convinced myself it didn't mean anything. Now, I wasn't so sure. I told myself not to look. Just lock the doors, go to bed, and forget about it. But curiosity has a way of digging in, pulling at you until you give in. I grabbed a flashlight, slipped on my sneakers, and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of pine. The chanting was louder now, coming from deep in the forest. I hesitated at the edge of the tree line, glancing back at my cottage. This was stupid. I didn't know these people or what they were doing, but something compelled me to keep going. Maybe I needed to see it, to prove to myself that this place wasn't as idyllic as it seemed. The woods were darker than I expected, my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart leap. I kept my distance from the voices, moving as quietly as I could. And then I saw the glow, lanterns, flickering like fireflies in the distance. I killed my flashlight and crept closer, keeping behind the trees. The clearing was like something out of a nightmare. A large stone altar stood at the center, its surface etched with carvings that seemed to writhe and shift in the lantern light. Around it, the townspeople formed a tight circle, swaying and chanting in unison. The sound was louder now, vibrating in my chest, almost too deep to be human. One of the townsfolk stepped forward, a man I recognized from the general store. He knelt before the altar, hands clasped in front of him, his head bowed. Two others stepped forward, tying his wrists together with thick rope. He didn't resist. I pressed my hand against a tree trunk to steady myself. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. A figure emerged from the crowd, their face hidden beneath a hood. They carried something in their hand, an ancient-looking knife, its blade curved and jagged. The chanting grew louder, almost deafening. The hooded figure approached the man on the altar, raising the knife high. I couldn't watch. I stumbled back, tripping over roots and branches, the chanting still echoing in my ears. I didn't look back until I was out of the woods, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The next morning, it was like nothing had happened. The streets were lively again, people waving and chatting like always. I stopped by the general store, half expecting the man from the altar to be missing. But there he was, stocking shelves like everything was normal. He even smiled at me, nodding a polite greeting. I felt sick. I wanted to ask him, "What happened last night? Why are you here?" But the words wouldn't come out. Instead, I waited until I saw Grace walking down the street. If anyone would give me a straight answer, I figured it would be her. "Morning, Randy," she called, her smile as warm as ever. "Morning," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Grace, can I ask you something?" "Of course." I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I saw something last night, in the woods." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened slightly. "Oh, you shouldn't go wandering at night," she said, her tone almost scolding. "It's not safe." I heard chanting. I pressed. "I saw people in altar." "What was that?" She tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "It's nothing to be concerned about," she said finally. "Just a little tradition we have. Tradition? To keep us safe," she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "We've always done it. You'll understand in time." Her words chilled me. There was no hesitation, no attempt to hide it. Whatever they were doing, they saw it as perfectly normal. "I don't think I want to understand," I said quietly. Grace smiled again, her expression softening. "Change is hard," she said, patting my arm. "But you'll see. We're all family here." I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But the more I thought about it, the less real it felt, like a half-remembered dream. Could I have imagined it? Maybe it wasn't a sacrifice at all. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate play or a reenactment. But then I'd remember the knife, the chanting, the man kneeling at the altar. That night I didn't hear chanting, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hooded figure and the glint of the knife. Something was wrong with this place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was already in too deep. The first sign that something was wrong with me came 3 nights after I'd spoken to Grace. I woke up in the dark, my heart pounding. My throat was dry, and my skin felt cold and clammy. At first, I thought it was a nightmare, one of those vivid, lingering ones that leaves you shaken even after you wake. But then I realized I was standing in the middle of the living room. I didn't remember getting out of bed. The faint sound of whispers drifted through the room, like voices coming from somewhere just out of reach. They weren't words exactly, more like the idea of words, garbled and distant. I turned on the lamp, flooding the room with light, and the whispers stopped immediately, leaving an unnatural silence behind. My hands were trembling as I made my way back to the bedroom, but I told myself it was stress. I hadn't been sleeping well since I moved here, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But the next morning, I noticed the markings. They were faint, just scratches really, but deliberate enough that they couldn't be random. Symbols carved into the wood of my front door and the frames of my windows. The shapes were strange, jagged and looping, almost like runes. They looked familiar, though I couldn't quite place where I'd seen them before. I spent half an hour scrubbing at the carvings with steel wool, but they wouldn't budge, as if they'd been etched straight into the grain. When I went into town later that day, I almost mentioned them to Grace, but stopped myself. I wasn't sure I wanted to know what she'd say. I kept telling myself I could leave. The idea was comforting, knowing I could pack up the car and drive away whenever I wanted. But I didn't. I couldn't. A few days later, Grace showed up unannounced. I was trying to sleep off another restless night when I heard the knock at the door. My stomach twisted. I wasn't in the mood for company, but ignoring her wasn't really an option. I dragged myself to the door and opened it to find her standing there, holding a plate of cookies and a steaming mug of tea. "You've been keeping to yourself," she said, her smile warm and maternal. "I thought you might like a little company." I hesitated, but she pushed past me, setting the plate and mug down on the kitchen counter. She moved with the ease of someone who'd been in the house 100 times before, even though this was the first time she'd stepped inside. "It's just a little herbal tea," she said, handing me the mug. "Good for nerves." I took it, my hand still shaking slightly. "Thanks." She looked around the kitchen, her eyes landing on the bundles of firewood stacked by the door. "You're settling in nicely. Everyone's been saying how well you fit in here." I almost laughed. I wouldn't say I fit in. She gave me a knowing look, as if I just said something foolish. "Oh, you will. Black Hollow has a way of making people part of the family." Her words sent a chill through me, but before I could say anything, she smiled and patted my arm. "Sunday night is the gathering," she said casually. "I'll see you there." I didn't answer, and she didn't wait for me to. She just walked out, humming to herself as she disappeared down the road. The invitation came the next day. I found it on the kitchen table when I woke up, though I had no memory of putting it there. A thick envelope sealed with wax, the kind you'd expect to see in a period drama. Inside was a card, handwritten in elegant script. "Dear Randy, you are cordially invited to join us at the gathering this Sunday as our honored guest. Welcome to the family." I stared at the card for a long time, my stomach churning. I didn't want to go. I knew what the gathering was, at least I thought I did. But the way the note was written, so formal and polite, made it feel less like an invitation and more like a command. When Sunday night came, I told myself I wouldn't go. I'd lock the door, turn off the lights, and pretend I wasn't home. But when the chanting started again, something in me shifted. It was like my body wasn't my own. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, drawn toward the sound like a moth to a flame. Grace was waiting for me at the edge of the woods, her smile soft and encouraging. "Come on," she said, taking my arm. "This is an important night for you." I wanted to pull away, to run, but my legs carried me forward, deeper into the trees. The clearing looked the same as before, the altar looming in the center, the lanterns casting flickering light over the crowd. But this time it was different. This time, all the faces were turned toward me. The hooded figures stepped forward, their shadows stretching unnaturally long across the ground. They held out a wooden cup filled with a black, viscous liquid that reeked of rot. "Drink," Grace whispered, her voice soothing and insistent. I hesitated, but when I looked around, I realized there was no way out. Every exit was blocked by swaying, chanting townsfolk, their blank faces illuminated by the lantern's glow. The cup was cold in my hands. My stomach turned as the liquid touched my lips, bitter and metallic. I gagged but forced it down, the taste clinging to my tongue like ash. Almost immediately, the world shifted. The trees around me twisted, their branches bending into grotesque shapes. The faces of the townsfolk blurred and stretched, their eyes black and hollow. Whispers filled the air, louder and louder, until they became a roar. I saw things that couldn't be real. A cavern dripping with dark, pulsing ichor. Shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't. A blood-red moon hanging low in the sky, its surface crawling with strange, writhing shapes. The ground beneath me buckled, and I fell into darkness. When I woke up, I was in my bed. The room was exactly as I'd left it, but the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. My body ached, my head pounding as if I'd been hit with a hammer. The invitation was gone. So was any sign that I'd been in the woods at all. I told myself it was just a dream, a vivid, horrible nightmare brought on by stress. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed, and it wasn't over. I woke up the morning after the gathering with the taste of rot still clinging to my tongue. My limbs felt heavy, like I'd been drugged, and my head pounded with a dull, relentless ache. Worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the house, every shifting shadow, sent a ripple of unease through me. The memory of the night before was fragmented, like a series of vivid nightmares stitched together by fear. The hooded figure, the chanting, the liquid that burned as it slid down my throat. And then darkness. I needed answers. It was clear now that Black Hollow wasn't just quirky or different. There was something deeply, fundamentally wrong with this place, and I wasn't leaving until I understood what it was. The library was exactly what you'd expect from a town like this. Small, dusty, and crumbling at the edges. The front door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the scent of mildew hit me immediately. The shelves were lined with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, their spines cracked and faded. There was no librarian, just a small bell on the counter that I didn't bother ringing. I doubted anyone here would want to help me anyway. I started with the local history section, pulling books and flipping through pages until my fingers were smudged with dust. Most of what I found was unremarkable. Records of harvest festivals, old photographs of smiling townsfolk, genealogies tracing back to the town's founders. But then I found it. Tucked away in the corner of a shelf, its cover warped and peeling, was a leather-bound journal. There was no title, just a name scrawled on the first page, Edgar Meeks. I sat down at one of the rickety wooden tables and began to read. Edgar Meeks was an outsider, just like me. He'd moved to Black Hollow in 1903, lured by the promise of cheap land and a fresh start. At first, he'd written about how much he loved the town. The friendly neighbors, the quiet nights, the sense of community. But then the tone of the journal shifted. There's something wrong with this place, he'd written in shaky, uneven letters. The people here, they're not like us. They speak in whispers, their smiles never quite reach their eyes. And the woods, oh God, the woods. As I read on, my stomach twisted. Edgar had written about strange symbols carved into his home, about waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of chanting. He'd followed the townsfolk into the woods and witnessed the rituals, just as I had. And then he wrote about the Shadow One. According to Edgar, the town worshipped an ancient deity, a being older than time itself. They called it the Shadow One, a creature that existed between worlds, feeding on fear and blood. The townsfolk believed that by offering sacrifices, they could appease the entity and keep it from consuming the town and themselves. The journal ended abruptly, the last page splattered with what looked like ink, but judging by the smudged fingerprints, could have been something darker. I closed the book, my hands trembling. On the inside of the back cover, someone had scrawled a single line in blocky, uneven handwriting. Once marked, there's no escape. I nearly ran back to the cottage, clutching the journal like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my vision blurred at the edges. When I reached the front door, I froze. The runes were back. The same jagged symbols I'd scrubbed off days ago were carved into the wood again, deeper this time. I dropped the journal, my knees threatening to buckle, and stared at the markings. One of them, an angular shape that reminded me of an eye, matched a sketch in the journal exactly. Once marked, there's no escape. I felt sick. I grabbed my car keys, barely pausing to lock the door behind me. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to leave. I needed to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the car wouldn't start. Not even a click. I tried again and again, my palms slick with sweat, but the engine was dead. Panic set in. I left the car and started walking, heading for the main road. The woods loomed on either side of me, their shadows long and twisting in the late afternoon light. I walked for what felt like hours, my feet aching and my throat dry. But no matter how far I went, the scenery didn't change. It was like the road was looping, folding back on itself. By the time the sun began to set, I was back in front of my cottage. I stumbled inside, locking the door and shoving a chair under the handle for good measure. My breathing was ragged, and my mind raced with 100 questions and no answers. That's when I felt it. The air in the room shifted, growing colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, creeping toward me like living things. And the whispers, they were back, louder now, hissing and murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. I grabbed the journal and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, clutching it like a shield. My eyes darted around the room, searching for whatever was watching me. But there was nothing there. Just shadows. The knock at the door nearly stopped my heart. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I didn't move. The knock came again, louder this time. "Randy," Grace's voice called, sweet and calm. "I brought you something." I stayed frozen, my hands clutching the journal, so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knock came a third time, followed by the sound of the door creaking open. Grace stepped inside, holding another bundle of herbs in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other. She smiled at me, whiter than I'd ever seen before. Her teeth were too white, too perfect. "Tomorrow," she said softly, placing the bundle on the table. "We're so glad you're ready." And then she turned and left, humming the same tune she always did. I didn't move for a long time after the door clicked shut. I just sat there, staring at the bundle of herbs, trying to ignore the whispers that hadn't stopped since she'd arrived. They came for me just before midnight. I'd been sitting on the floor of my cottage, staring at the front door like I could will it to stay closed. The whispers hadn't stopped, not since Grace's visit. They slithered through the room like snakes, coiling around my mind and squeezing until I couldn't think straight. When the door burst open, I didn't even have time to scream. A group of them, 6 or 7, stormed inside, their faces blank and eyes wide with an eerie, glazed look. They moved with mechanical precision, grabbing me before I could run. I thrashed, kicked, even bit, but it was no use. Their grip was inhumanly strong. They gagged me with a strip of rough cloth and tied my wrists together, dragging me outside as I tried to scream through the gag. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, a chaotic jumble of fear and anger and disbelief. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The lanterns were already lit, their golden glow flickering through the trees as we entered the woods. The chanting began almost immediately, low and guttural, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. The same horrible rhythmic drone I'd heard so many nights before. This time I was the center of it. The clearing came into view, and my stomach turned. The altar stood in the center, more imposing than ever, its surface slick with something dark and wet. The carvings seemed to pulse in the lantern light, as though they were alive. The entire town was there, their faces blank and emotionless, their eyes fixed on me as I was dragged into the circle. Grace stood at the altar, her hood pulled back to reveal her face. She was smiling, but it wasn't the warm, maternal smile she always wore. It was something else entirely, something cruel and predatory. "Randy," she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of something unnatural. It was layered, like two voices speaking in perfect unison, one hers, and one deeper, colder, and inhuman. "You should be honored. Your sacrifice will seal the pact for another generation. Black Hollow will prosper because of you." I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. I tried to scream, but the gag muffled the sound. Grace ignored my protests, raising her hands to the crowd. "Tonight, we honor the Shadow One. Tonight, we give thanks for his protection and his blessings." The crowd roared in response, their voices merging into a terrible, guttural howl. Grace turned back to me, her eyes glinting with something feral. She held the knife in her hand, the same jagged, ancient blade I'd seen before. Its surface shimmered, almost alive, as though it were drinking in the light. She stepped closer, and the chanting grew louder, the sound pounding in my ears. I thought I was going to die, but I'd come prepared. In the chaos of the past day, I'd managed to hide a sharp rock in my pocket, just in case. My fingers worked furiously behind my back, scraping the rock against the ropes binding my wrists. The fibers were thick, and my movements were clumsy, but desperation has a way of sharpening your focus. Grace raised the knife high, the blade catching the lantern light. And then, the rope snapped. I didn't think. I just moved. I swung my arms forward, slamming into Grace with as much force as I could muster. She staggered back, the knife slipping from her hand and clattering to the ground. For a brief moment, the crowd froze, their chanting faltering as they stared in stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. I tore off the gag and ran, shoving through the circle of townsfolk. They screamed, their voices distorted and unnatural, and I could hear the pounding of footsteps behind me. The woods stretched out in front of me like a black labyrinth, but I didn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I kept running. Branches whipped at my face, tearing at my skin, and the ground was uneven and treacherous. Behind me, the townsfolk were gaining. Their movements weren't natural. They were too fast, too smooth, like their joints didn't work the way human joints should. Their glowing lanterns bobbed and weaved through the trees, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to reach for me. I tripped, landing hard on my hands and knees. Pain shot through my left wrist, but I forced myself up, adrenaline drowning out the agony. And then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, faintly lit by the first rays of dawn. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest, and burst out of the woods into the light. The chanting stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned back, gasping for breath, but the woods were silent. The townsfolk were gone. At first, I thought I'd made it. The relief was overwhelming, and I dropped to my knees, sobbing. The rising sun bathed the clearing in golden light, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I thought I was safe. But then I saw my arm. At first, I thought it was just a scratch, a deep cut from the fall. But as I looked closer, I realized the lines weren't random. They were symbols, runes like the ones carved into my door and the altar. They spread across my skin in jagged, looping patterns, glowing faintly in the morning light. My stomach turned as I watched the lines grow, branching out like veins, spreading across my body. I stumbled to a nearby stream, desperate to wash them off. But when I looked down into the water, my reflection stopped me cold. It wasn't me. The face staring back was wrong. Familiar but twisted, with hollow black eyes and a mouth that curved into a grotesque, too wide smile. I screamed, stumbling back from the water. The runes on my arm pulsed, and the shadows around me seemed to shift, growing darker and denser. They moved in my peripheral vision, twisting and writhing like they were alive. I made it to a road sometime that afternoon. It wasn't the main road out of Black Hollow. This one was narrow, winding, and unfamiliar. But it didn't matter. I kept walking, hoping I'd find help, find someone who could explain what was happening to me. When I saw a gas station up ahead, I almost cried with relief. The attendant looked up as I stumbled inside, his eyes widening when he saw me. "Jesus, what happened to you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the words came out wrong. My voice was distorted, warbling and broken, like the sound of a cassette tape being mangled in a player. The man took a step back, his face pale. I raised my hands, trying to show him I wasn't a threat, but that's when I noticed it. My left hand was gone. I hadn't even realized it at first, the pain dulled by the overwhelming terror of the night. All that was left was a raw, jagged stump, still bleeding sluggishly. I tried again, but the sound that came out wasn't human. The attendant bolted into the back room, and I collapsed against the counter, shaking uncontrollably. The shadows on the floor twisted, stretching toward me like long, grasping fingers. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I couldn't block out the whispers that echoed in my skull. I escaped the cult, but I didn't escape whatever it left inside me. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.